Good afternoon and welcome to today's seminar in sustainable development. It's my great pleasure to introduce Irwin Redlener, who is the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, who will lead us, together with a panel of distinguished experts, through a session that deals with Ebola and the politics of pandemic. I will introduce Irwin briefly, and then Irwin will introduce the speakers as they come up. So we will have 4 presentations, and after that we will have time for questions and answers from the audience. So Irwin is actually a pediatrician by profession. Here at Columbia, he is the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the US Institute, and he also directs the US Institute's program on child well-being and resilience. Most of you probably have encountered Irwin either on TV or on radio, because he is somebody who is in high demand when there is a disaster of any kind. Sandy comes to mind, Haiti disaster, and then of course Ebola most recently. So as the nationally recognized expert that he is, he has been appointed to many entities that are dealing with issues related to disasters. For example, I will just name a few. He was appointed by Governor Andrew Cuomo to co-chair the New York State Ready Commission. He also recently served as one of the 10 members of the congressionally established National Commission on Children and Disasters. In 2014, this year, he was appointed as special advisor to New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. Some of you might have come across Irwin's book, Americans at Risk: Why We Are Not Prepared for Mega Disasters and What We Can Do Now, which appeared in 2006. That's, if you haven't come across that, that's well worth picking up and reading. Irwin is also the president and co-founder of, together with Paul Simon, of the Children's Health Fund, which is a philanthropic initiative which was created to develop healthcare programs in 25 of the nation's most medically underserved urban and rural communities. So without further ado, I would like to ask Irwin to come to the podium, give his remarks, and then lead us through the panel contributions and then through the discussion that follows that. Please welcome Irwin Redlener.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome to all of you. I'm very glad to be here, but I always here wherever I am with bad news. So, but it's not, well, I mean, there's hopefulness buried in here someplace, and I'll try to lay that out as well. But this particular episode, this situation that we're dealing with, has a number of different faces and perspectives, and I'm going to try to differentiate here, and I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to do this, between what is happening in West Africa and what is happening in the United States and Spain and other parts of the world. The reality is that we're dealing with highly interrelated, but let me just open this up here. Highly interrelated, but really very different scenarios between the African reality of an actual epidemic and whatever you want to call this here in the United States. Somebody told me yesterday that the chances of dying from Ebola in the United States of America are about 150 times less than dying from your pajamas catching on fire. And you know, there's like people have made like 100 analogies based on actual statistics and prevalence of issues that we are certainly very, very concerned, and we're concerned for a variety of reasons that may or may not be related to the actual science. So that means that the communications issues, which you're going to hear about a little bit later, around this, what public officials are supposed to say or not say, in an environment where there's a lot of there's a certain amount of science. The science is okay, but not perfect. And now you're the president or a governor or the mayor, and you're trying to figure out what it is that you're going to say from the podium. And it's really tricky. We were on the phone this morning with the Ebola czar, Ron Klain, and a few from Colombia, but I gathered a few from other parts of the country also, talking about the translation of science into messaging. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So, and my remarks are going to be about Ebola, but I'm really interested in what is it that we're deriving from this. The cliche is, what is the lesson learned? And I'm going to talk about that concept also in just a minute. But really, we have to understand not only what Ebola per se, as a virus, as a lethal disease if you happen to get it, and especially if you live in a under-resourced region of the world, that's true, but it also has taken the lid off some other sort of open secrets about the state of our general state of our readiness here in the United States to deal with large-scale disasters. We're going to hear some about the economic impact of an epidemic, what it means for the private sector, and we're going to hear some very interesting perspectives on covering this. I'm going to call it a crisis because on some level it certainly is a crisis. It's a global crisis with its own particular idiosyncratic manifestations here in New York and in the United States. And what do you do with that silence, with the science about Ebola, and make it into policy, and then the policy to communications and public messaging bridge is another aspect of this, which makes it all very tricky. I think I'm not going to explicitly talk about this, but I think there's some general lessons in this about what we do with scientific information and public communication, and what's the purpose of the communication. Sometimes it's informing people. Sometimes it's trying to keep us safe. Sometimes it's trying to alter large-scale policies that will be important for the future, and climate change would be an issue in that realm. But there's a particular aspect or aspects of crisis communication and risk communication that come into play with this particular issue. So the first point, which is, I'm sure, obvious, is that, and I alluded to it already, that there's a very big difference between the situation in Africa, true epidemic, and the situation in the United States, where to date it's had very little actual medical or health impact. 315 million or whatever is in the United States, we got a guy sick, mildly sick, at Bellevue. We had one death of a guy who came with Ebola and didn't get really into an appropriate medical environment until it was too late to save him. And we've had a couple other people who have been tested positive who have done fine. So that's the entire extent of it. It's not even recordable. It's not measurable on any scale that has to do with the actual things we deal with. And for those of you who don't know, from just the regular seasonal flu, we have 36,000 deaths per year, every year. And usually way under 50% of the population getting their flu shots. So there's something very disproportionate. There's probably a lot of reasons for this, and I'm sure we're going to hear about some of that in a little bit. So, and the subway car is here because tremendous furor over the fact that Craig Spencer, the doctor at Bellevue, who has Ebola, took some subway rides. He handled the poles, the straps, and he went bowling. And there's people like in Oregon who said they're never going bowling again in case he may have slipped into Oregon. They didn't realize it or whatever. So very, very disproportionate, and interestingly so, if you're interested in that kind of thing, very disproportionate reaction. And on the official side of things, this has become an unbelievable topic of conversation. This is Ron Klain, the guy we were on the phone with a few hours ago, with the president. He's the Ebola czar. He's actually called the Ebola coordinator. And he's not a public health guy, but a very smart guy. And actually, I was first puzzled, but then I'm thinking, we really do need somebody who's strong and politically astute to actually move things along in the processes within government. And Tom Frieden, the CDC director, you probably remember just within the last couple of weeks when there was a big sort of breakdown in the relationship or communication around this issue between the Governor Cuomo, and Bill de Blasio. Bill de Blasio is fanatically interested in what is the science telling us, and whatever the science is telling us, that's what I'm going to be talking about. I was at a meeting actually with Cuomo and de Blasio on Thursday, just before the press conference when Craig Spencer was admitted to Bellevue, and they had their health advisors there, and I was there, and the other commissioners, and they were very, very cooperative, collaborative. We had Frieden on the phone, on the conference phone, and everything was sort of hunky-dory, and they decided together what their statements were going to be. The next thing on Friday, he's in, our governor's in New Jersey, and they make this announcement that, de Blasio wasn't even aware of, and this is when they decided to quarantine the nurse from Maine or whatever. So it's a very complicated political situation with a lot of players in it, as you can imagine. If you don't know, that's Mary Bassett, our health commissioner. So many questions have been raised since Ebola appeared in the United States, and the first set of questions had to do with what the hell is going on in Texas, because it was a public example of horrendous medical care and public health response simultaneously. These are two different streams of thinking here. So there's a public health infrastructure in the U.S., of course, and there's a healthcare system, and they're basically in separate silos. They operate different agendas, different speeds, different MOs, and so forth. And both of those systems really kind of failed very, very visibly under an incredibly nonstop 24/7 news cycle. It was terrible. So I don't have to recount. I'm sure you've read about what went on at the hospital. He was seen in the ER and miscommunications. He went home, was readmitted, and he died. On the public health side, he came and stayed at this apartment here in Dallas and to meet with his fiancée and some other relatives and friends. The public health system allowed them to just remain in that place. 8 days it took them to remove the contaminated bed sheets from the bodily fluids of this very sick individual before anyone figured out, we have to go get that and deal with it. And it was just kind of one horror story after another. And a lot of questions raised that were noticed by every other public health system and every other public health agency, and every other hospital in America, probably in the world. We're just watching this mortified and trying to figure out how they had to scramble to fix it so it wouldn't happen in their place. But the point I wanted to make here before we go on to the other speaker is this big question that was revealed by what happened with the Ebola case in Texas. And the question is the question really that's been the subject matter of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness since we started back in 2003. Is the United States prepared for large-scale disasters? So this brings up lots of different sub-issues and questions and need for analysis, including do we understand how to plan for a big event in terms of the scale and scope? Are the systems coordinated that need to be? And if you're planning for a coastal storm at a citywide tabletop exercise, you have every conceivable agency there. It's the health department, the Office of Emergency Management, NYPD, the fire department, et cetera, because really in the larger disaster, the more it is critical for there to be a lot of collaboration among the various agencies that are working. And what are the priorities? So if you're the mayor of a city or a governor of a state and you have whatever your limited budget is to do this kind of planning, what are you actually planning for? Because planning for a major act of terrorism versus a coastal storm versus a biological event are all very different situations. So somebody has to decide what is it that we're actually planning for. And that decision is not easy, and it varies. And since we live in a federalist society, every state, and in the case of New York City, many local jurisdictions get to make those decisions. So we have really a national hodgepodge of random acts of preparedness is what I've referred to as, and no whole cloth. They could say, this is what the country's prepared for. By the way, would anyone like to say what you think a prepared city, what would that mean? It's a rhetorical question, kind of, because we have no idea what it means. So therefore, you have to plan to be prepared to have a goal which you can't define exactly. Because if you're prepared for a biological event, it doesn't mean you're prepared for a coastal storm. or for an airplane crashing into the World Trade Center, or a chemical spill, or an anthrax attack. So we invest this enormous amount of money year after year in Homeland Security that arose de novo after 9/11 without actually knowing what the goal is for these hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that have been spent. It's a very odd situation. Workforce issues, funding issues. Well, if these are the sub-elements of getting prepared, whatever that might be, everyone agrees we have to be prepared, but not exactly sure for what. But none of these issues have been sufficiently answered really any place in the United States or the United States as a whole. And so behind the scenes what's happening is that there has been, for a lot of reasons, one has to do with budget cutting and all that stuff and conservative budget development. We've had things like, what's here is the amount of funding per year for the Hospital Preparedness Program for Disasters in the United States. And when the appropriations were first made back in 2003 and 2004, it was $500 million a year. That's all to the left there. And that number was felt to be inadequate to begin with by experts. We had 5,000 hospitals, $500 million a year was not really enough. Panels of experts recommending at least $1 billion a year, but anyways, $500 million. What's happened behind the scenes to this low-hanging fruit for budget cutters is a gradual diminution until we get down to 14 and 15, where we're dealing with funding levels of half of that, about $255 million a year, to underfund already underfunded vital program. And so when everyone now is up in arms saying, oh, well, the hospitals have to be more prepared. They need training and retraining and retraining, which they do, but we've basically cut the legs off that because of these cutbacks. The same thing, probably a little bit less severe, but very important cuts in the public health infrastructure. So the local public health agencies, including the New York City Department of Health, also dramatic cuts. This happens to be a program called Public Health Emergency Preparedness Funding, or the FEP program, and this has been dramatically cut as well. How much has been cut? Well, since 2008, 50,000 public health positions have been lost across the United States. So now we say, oh, here's Ebola, and we have to now monitor whatever many people you think are in contact. That is a tremendous workforce demand. So these public health agencies that were getting by day to day with what they had to do with their core public health functions, now comes a crisis. We expect them to surge. Well, they actually don't have enough people to take care of the day-to-day functions of a health department and respond to a surge. And by the way, I'm calling it a surge because it's been a surge to a certain degree and certainly feels from a public messaging point of view like a surge. But what if we had a real epidemic or pandemic, let's say, where we really, really need to surge? We don't have the capacity in the hospital system, certainly, or in the public health system. So I think this is the last point I want to really make that's, I think, relatively important. So if we say we'd like to be prepared, I've already acknowledged the fact that we don't know how to define it. But where this red arrow is, let's say, is where we were starting from when we first made that statement, which is more or less right after 9/11. Now, we're not aiming to be 100% prepared because it would create a society that you actually wouldn't want to live in. So we have some sort of realistic goal that's short of 100% prepared, but way better than we have now. So let's say we're going to ask the question, well, where are we now? Have we made any progress? Well, yes, we have made some progress. We're here at the orange arrow. And how do you interpret that? This is, let's say, since 9/11, 01, and now we're at the orange arrow. Well, what's interesting is it depends on what you want to say or how you want to spin it. You can say, well, we're doing fine, or we're way behind. My glass always being half empty. I'm wildly frustrated about the fact that we're actually way, way behind, and we spent just untellable fortunes of money on this. But if you're the commissioner of the Office of Emergency Management or the State Health Department or HHS in Washington, where you're responsible for something, and the boss says, maybe the Secretary of HHS, maybe the President, how are we doing? Well, we're doing great. We have now the Strategic National Stockpile of Emergency Supplies is twice as big as it was in 01. Yeah, but it needed to be 20 times as big. So there's a lot of spinning and messaging and trying to control the message and trying to do something other than, are we getting closer to the goal at a fast enough rate? So is the U.S. prepared for large-scale disasters? The answer is no. And for the Ebola thing, a couple of points before we go on to the speakers. So first point is that there's no stopping the anxiety in America or the possibility of more Ebola in America, which I think is absolutely inevitable, unless we eradicate it in Africa. That's plain and simple. The focus has to be on Africa. And the president's recent requests for, I think, 6 billion, 4 billion, somewhere in there, hopefully will be mostly directed to dealing with stopping the Ebola crisis in Africa, eradicating it there, and that's really the treatment for what we're seeing here. We have to focus on funding and resources, generally speaking, for disaster preparedness, and we really do have to focus on science. The Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences earlier this week had a meeting on the science of Ebola, and you know, we know certain things and we don't know a lot of things about this really. You know, we talk about the 21-day incubation period. It's true, but the data comes from, it's experiential, it's not really all that really scientific, and there's cases of that people are saying, well, you know, we had 3 cases in Liberia in the last time we had Ebola there, and 2 of them appeared at day 25, or 1 of them appeared at day 41 or something. And so that doesn't mean that that's true, or that we should extend, heaven forbid, the quarantine to 42 days or 26 days. I'm just telling you that a lot of the things that we're declaring as science are, you know, they wouldn't necessarily meet Peter's definition or John Mutter's definition of science to the point that everything else is excluded, right? So anyway, these are the things that I think we are very interested in now, and this is not a lesson in how to treat Ebola, this little seminar here. This is about some aspects of this situation that we just want to share with you, and I think, Amy, you're going first, is that correct? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to bring up, you're going to hear from 3 speakers who will comprise the panel, and then we want to leave time for a lot of discussion and questions, as long as they're not hard questions. Can we guarantee that? We can't guarantee that. So the first presenter is Amy Fairchild, and if you don't know her, she's a professor of socio-medical sciences at the Mailman School. She has had a very interesting career looking into some of the more vexing problems and challenges we've had in dealing with the ethics of public health, the history of public health. She was acting chair of that department for a good long period of time. How long exactly?
4 years.
4 years. Yeah. She did this as a favor to the dean, and she did a spectacular job. I personally wish she would have stayed, but she has her own stuff to do, and she has been published widely on the issues of ethics and history of public health, and she's very insightful, and I'm looking forward to her remarks.
Thank you, Irwin, and thanks to those of you who have come out on this dreary, I'm going to call it a winter's day, and I think we're all sort of probably feeling like it's 9 o'clock at night, but we don't really know what time it is at all. So, being a historian, I have to give every talk I give a title. That's kind of how I start to get my head around things. And I'm going to really be talking about the politics of panic. And I think it's very easy to start from the assumption that panic is a bad thing. So ask yourself, you know, how do you define panic in your mind? And while I don't want to suggest that panic is a good thing and we should be running out saying, yay, panic, we need more of it, I do want to make the point that it definitely has its uses and its abuses. And I think we've been missing an opportunity to think really critically about the politics of panic with all the hand-wringing that we're doing over how do we damp down and tamp down the irrational and reactionary thinking on the part of a lot of the American citizenry and politicians as well. So what I'm going to do is take just a few examples from history as a way to begin to think not just about panic, but about the relationship between panic and crisis. Two terms that I think begin to get conflated as we're thinking about the Ebola situation, and we'll call it the Ebola crisis. So to give you a very simple definition of crisis, and I have to thank Connie Nathanson for this. Connie, raise your hand and wave. Connie's an esteemed sociologist, and she and Kavita Sivaramakrishnan, who's coming up next, and I are working together on a project that's funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities to think about the relationship between panic and crisis, starting from the mid-19th century all the way through Ebola now. And Connie has very thoughtfully, but given us a very precise way of thinking about crisis as a period of destabilization in societal routines. So, in other words, crisis happens when institutions, when systems, when policies fail, or to act in the way that we expected, or we find that they're not there at all. So there's a gap. And they fail to act in the way that we expected or hoped in the face of a problem, in the face of a disaster, in the face of a, fill in the blank there. But the point is that not every, even by that way of thinking, not every disaster would amount to a crisis. We can have a disaster in which our systems and our institutions and our policies respond precisely the way that we would expect them to. So to give you an example from the middle of the 19th century, if you look at the yellow fever epidemics, Yellow Jack as it was called, it creates a crisis, and there you see an image of Yellow Jack pulling people into the grave, the state helpless to do anything, precisely because there were no institutions to manage yellow fever. There was nothing in place. There were no permanent boards of health in the United States at this moment in time. Panic now is something that's a little bit harder to pin down, I think, conceptually, in part because it's accumulated different meanings over time. So I think if you've been thinking of your own definitions of panic, like I suggested that you do, we probably think of it as irrational behavior in the face of a crisis, as hysteria, something that has no grounding in science or in reality. But in the context of yellow fever, it was just as likely to imply rational action, maybe even a kind of helpful action by getting people out of harm's way. But certainly it represented a kind of unanticipated, or maybe the word is unsanctioned, collective action in the face of a crisis. So when it came to yellow fever, the nature of panic was, in the midst of an epidemic, get the heck out of Dodge, right? Get out of town. Do what you need to do to flee. And the reaction on the part of those neighboring communities, of course, was to take up your shotguns to try to keep these guys out of your own community, to try to stave off this kind of exodus. So the epidemics of yellow fever, and then a little bit also in the 19th century cholera, are going to give us a powerful impulse to develop permanent, powerful boards of health. So you have the New York City Board of Health created in 1866. It's the first municipal board of health anywhere in the world, and historians have called it the most important event in the history of public health. 1866, the creation of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. There's the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, or an image of it as kind of the goddess Hygeia, who is there with her protective wings and sword and shield to stave off the crises, the epidemics that had plagued us in the throughout most of the 19th century. And if you could see the little image below, it would be Colonel Waring's white wings that were created later in the century, marching along the streets, cleaning up the mess that was one of the major contributors to epidemic disease in the 19th century. But what we find then, as we move into the 20th century, is that these institutions that are created in the name of crisis and in the name of panic also then create the need to contain not only disease, but to contain panic as well. So in the context of the influenza epidemic, which kills almost 500,000 people in the United States and 40 million people worldwide in 1918 and 1919. And so in the face of this real devastation, locales in the U.S. begin to expand the police powers of the state. So you see things like mask ordinances, prohibitions on gathering in public, social distancing measures, no church, no theaters, no public transportation, really. We don't see new institutions being created, in other words, like we did with yellow fever, but we see new powers, new authority being given to the ones that are already there. And as I said, you begin to hear a lot of talk about the need to manage crisis, need to manage panic, just as you manage disease itself. So this is the Commissioner of Health in New York City saying, Royal Copeland saying, in 1918, my aim was to prevent panic, hysteria, mental disturbance, and thus to protect the public from the conditions of mind that in itself predisposes to physical ills. So you hear a lot of talk of this nature. It's just important to manage the panic as it is to manage disease. But what's so striking is that around this period of time, when panic begins to take on these new meanings and this new sort of managerial implications, is it also becomes defined now as something unreasoning, almost atavistic, where people act in self-centered, egocentric ways, and it's seen as something unhealthy. You can kind of get hints of that in the Copeland quote. And in part, this is because the idea of panic raises this question, well, is this now a threat to institutional authority? We don't want the people to take this, their unruly rabble to take these actions upon themselves. We want the government to do it. And who is in control then if the population panics? So perhaps the most interesting thing, if you look at the flu outbreak, the pandemic, is that even though the media is brimming with talk of panic, it's here, it's there, it's everywhere, we don't see the old 19th century variety of panic where people are picking up and leaving town, but rather panic comes to serve as a kind of judgment, a means of critique. So you see a lot of talk about health officials losing their heads and talking excitedly and about all sorts of extravagant conditions as the only possible means preventing the decimation of a city's population. So mask ordinances were particularly loathed by populations. But for the most part, people in fact adhered to these measures. So when health officials weren't being critiqued in that way, you would see the opposite thing being said, that they didn't act fast enough. And if only we had acted sooner, we might have had panic, but now we have panic stalked by wild, devastating death. So the question I've been asking myself is about the 1918 flu pandemic was it a crisis? I mean, even though you have talk like this, for the most part, the collective sense was that health officials managed it quite well, and the things that happened really, really worked. So it may not have reached the level of crisis, but panic played a really important role in how we as health officials thought about managing that epidemic. Now, in the context of the nuclear arms race, in which officials begin to worry about the threat of biowarfare for the first time, what happens is that we see crises and panics being anticipated. So it's not just that we're responding to the outbreak of yellow fever or cholera or influenza, but we're anticipating anthrax, some of these other biological agents being dropped in the United States. And what happens is that these notions of crises and panic become very hard, at least in my mind so far, to tease apart. But what we do see is government officials, this is a quote from Val Peterson, who was Eisenhower's first head of the Federal Civil Defense Administration, beginning to use panic as a way to make the case for more institutions. So he writes that panic could produce a chain reaction more deeply destructive than any explosive known. Mass panic, not the A-bomb, may be the easiest way to win a battle, the cheapest way to win a war. And then he goes on to say that, so he's describing what would happen, and it almost feels like a scene from a zombie movie. What would happen in New York City if there was a biological or a nuclear attack? And he writes that those who did succeed in fleeing the island would pour into adjacent areas to become a hungry, pillaging mob, disrupting disaster relief, overwhelming local police, and spreading panic in a widening arc. So, obviously the institutions come before he's making these statements, but sometimes the panic is used as a way to create institutions, then what we see here, this is Alexander Langmuir, who is one of the founding figures in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and he is the father of what we call the EIS, the Epidemic Intelligence Service, that's created in the 1950s. And what he does is he very explicitly says, in retrospect, that what he did was he played on the emotional tension about biowarfare that was building up to these unbelievable levels in the administration. And on the one hand, he was genuinely concerned about biowarfare, but on the other hand, he knew he was being entirely opportunistic, that this was a chance to get federal military funds to create something in the United States, to create a permanent structure that was going to be able to respond to outbreaks. And if it took the threat of biowarfare to do that, he was going to seize that opportunity. So this is the period of time in which, in my mind, it becomes the politics of crisis, the politics of panic become very complicated. Who is it that's panicking? Is it the public? Is it policymakers? It's not clear whether the anxiety, at least not clear to me yet, whether the anxiety was warranted. And I think sometimes we have to be prepared to say, well, maybe we should be feeling more concern. Maybe we should be feeling a sense of alarm, if not panic, over public health crises. Perhaps global warming is one of those things. And regardless of what we might think about the ethics of scaring people, then I think we have to ask whether the ends are legitimate. And we might have different feelings depending on if we're talking about the EIS or we're talking about the Federal Civil Defense Administration or some other institutions that get created in the wake of panic. And of course, this brings us to, but what's interesting about the Cold War era is that by the 1960s, you have this growing critique now of the political use of panic. Panic is kind of seen as a ploy, precisely because the reasons we saw with Langmuir. And so there's this idea that it's not good enough to scare us into being good, and this isn't the way to create institutions. It's not the way to craft public policy. And there's a pushback against a lot of these federal preparedness programs that so much defined the Cold War era in America. Now, when we get to September 11th, I think it's a little bit easier to see the relationship between crisis and panic. We have attacks on the World Trade Center, on the Pentagon. We have the anthrax attack, and it's in the wake of those that we realize, even though we had been thinking about whether we were prepared since the 1990s. Think about the sarin gas attacks in Tokyo. September 11th makes it very clear that we're not prepared, and this is a point that Irwin also made. And in here, we can kind of see the full panoply of the uses and abuses of panic. So we have the sensationalist media coverage. If you take the anthrax scare, here we are, Anthrax Nation, and that's one of many examples I could have given you. You probably remember others yourself. We see the old Cold War rhetoric. Remember Val Peterson, panic is the most important weapon. Well, now we have panic as the next super weapon, trying to make the case that we need these new institutions and new preparations. And we do see new institutions like the Department of Homeland Security. We see new policies, such as the Model State Emergency Powers Act, which is model legislation. I can't remember. I don't know exactly how many states have adopted it. At the last count, I think it was something like 13. But it really makes it very easy to create almost martial law conditions in the face of a national disaster. And these policies have been critiqued by people like George Annis, who is at Boston University, who has got a long track record in human rights, who then uses panic as critique, right? He's saying constructive public health legislation cannot be drafted under panic conditions. So we begin to see that panic has all these different uses, all these different meanings, depending on what's at stake. And of course, then the national panic, some would argue, a lot of this was sort of a prelude to war. So, to begin to wrap this up by turning back to Ebola, I think the point I would make is we haven't taken a critical look at the politics of panic. And the thing that has struck me most, Irwin said at the beginning that the things we do have to flow from science. And I don't disagree with that, but as I'm hearing Tom Frieden and others, I'm hearing science, and this absolute certainty, as though we're wrapping ourselves in a kind of mantle of science, and not as a way to maybe almost mask the political elements of this, as if science is going to keep the politics out of this. And I think what it ends up doing is denying the politics of panic in a way, at least on the part of health officials, that's not very helpful. And I think even if we haven't acknowledged it, certainly we have been engaged. Certainly health officials have been engaged in the politics of panic. So one of the things I did as a little exercise for myself, this is kind of quick and dirty, and this is a little bit hard to read. I just began to do a Nexus Lexis search. So the red bars there are, oh, you can't read that at all. So the red bars there are, but I can make this easier, are sort of the number of hits that you get for panic. In the months before, you have the CDC press conference on Duncan. The orange bar is the discussion of travel bans, and then that last yellow bar is the discussion of mandatory quarantine. And what you see here, so this is the little picture of the hospital. That's when the CDC has their press conference telling us what's happened with Duncan, right? So you see the panic levels dropping. That's the red bar. You have the first nurse infected. You see the panic levels are still dropping. And the discussions of travel bans are also dropping. Though when you get the first nurses infected, you begin to see the first hits on the discussion of mandatory quarantine. But then here, when you have nurse number 2, look what happens to panic. The panic hits, that's the red bar, it goes through the ceiling. You have the discussions, the orange, of travel bans, of really kind of going up in a meteoric fashion. And then when you have Spencer and Casey Hickox quarantined, that's when you see this rise in the discussion of the need for mandatory measures. And if you begin, so this is kind of really, this is the crisis point. If I were sort of say, what's the point at which the crisis happens? It's when the second nurse is infected. It's when reality belies what the scientists have been telling us. And you can, the policy development sort of follows this picture. So before you had nurse number 2, you had the airport screenings coming in at a moment in which there was rising talk about travel bans when you're taking our temperatures, even though a lot of the discussion amongst health officials was this is not really going to be anything that's going to make us safer. It might make us feel safe, but it's not necessarily going to make us safer. And it's at this point, after the second nurse is infected, that we then have our Ebola czar. We have beginning to limit entry to only a few airports in the United States from West Africa. You have the beginnings of active monitoring, and then, of course, after Spencer, you have the New Jersey and New York quarantine decisions, and then the CDC protocols that go beyond what I believe they were saying was based, what the science would have told us, at least at the outset of the epidemic. So one of the things that I would argue is that, in fact, we need to sort of engage in the politics of panic and not treat it like something that needs to be eradicated, and understand it as something that's recurrent historically, and that's entirely predictable, and that's going to be part of policy making, and we need to accept that. It's a way to create new effective institutions, more funding streams, new policies. Now, to be sure, there are risks, because you might get policy that doesn't make us safer and that flies in the face of democratic traditions. And certainly we have to judge our policies through the lens of science. But I worry, again, that if we wrap ourselves in this mantle of science, and if health officials aren't the ones being very explicit about the trade-offs that we have to make between science and civil liberties, being very explicit about discussing these moral trade-offs, that we're sort of losing an opportunity as people in public health to be transparent and to really engage in the politics of panic in a productive way, bearing in mind that we need to do something other than making gestures that paper over the politics of panic. So that's where I end, and that's where I think Kavita is going to take off after you introduce her.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's really... Thanks, Amy. It was really very provocative and interesting and relevant to the sort of big picture of what's going on here, and thank you for doing that. Langmuir, talking about the hungry, pillaging mob. I can only assume he was at a Redlener family Thanksgiving dinner, and, but anyway, yeah, I think A lot to digest there. I'm sure we'll get quite a lot of questions. But right now, I would like to introduce Kavita Sivarama Makrishnan. And she, was it close?
No, it was very close.
Okay. All right, there you go. Kavita is an assistant professor at Socio-Medical Sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health here at Columbia. And she has a number of different issues that she's working on, including, I think, several books at this point, one of which having to do with demographic anxieties about aging. Is that contagious, or because I seem yeah, and actually what seems like a very different view about aging and different perspectives on it, I think is going to be something interesting. I'd look forward to seeing that. A book on the changing meanings of public health in terms of panics and epidemics. I think you are both working on that book, and then another book on the politics of heart disease, science, and modernization in India. So you have some very interesting perspectives we talked about the other day, and why don't you come up and share them with the rest of us?
So I don't have slides. I do have a talk that I'll read, and I'll go from a place where politicians hug to visit cultures where you're not supposed to hug, partly because the panic and crisis is very, very real. So what I aim to do is that Amy talked about the contingencies that shape crisis and panic historically in the US. And what I want to do is to build on these ideas to look at what kinds of disease identities are associated with Ebola in Asia and Africa, particularly the ways in which recently the media has built up these disease identities, and not simply just as biological events, as disease outbreaks, but also as a source of political and social anxieties, in particular how they're reflected as political anxieties. So I want to go back. So I'll move between two kinds of time zones. I'll start with talking about the late 1970s, when Ebola first emerges. The outbreaks first were recorded in Zaire and Sudan. They killed about 600 people then, and at that point, the ways in which the Western press was looking at Ebola was very much as a threat that was endemic, it was rural, and it was local. It was primarily an African malady, and they were mostly exploring local families, and it was based on it was associated with the sorts of local custom and care-based transmission that was associated with it. So at that point, there were studies in 1977 and 79. They were one of the studies was led by a WHO team in Zaire, and another one by the CDC in southern Sudan. And both these teams gave a series of press interviews to the LA Times, to the Washington Post. And at that point, the head of the WHO team is a virologist called Paul Bress. And Paul Bress works with the health ministry is in Zaire. And the entire tone is really about how these virus chasers, in a way, are making this heroic effort to visit 17,000 houses, he says, 301 villages in Zaire. And this is really an effort to determine the source and the scope of the epidemic. And the LA Times that reports this visit says that the investigations of this multinational team implied that the team went to Africa, and they say that it returned unharmed, very much like the visits of missionaries and explorers in the 19th century to Africa, and that after they had returned, it had been disbanded. But the source of the virus remained a mystery. And Paul Bress at that point says that another outbreak will occur of Ebola, but he says preparedness for Ebola internationally needs to be very local, and he focused really on flying plasma into affected areas to treat patients. Most of what these people were doing were really to start treatment by collecting plasma from patients who were survivors. And he says that we need to just simply fly plasma into affected areas to treat patients. And the path to preparedness, he says, is to give plasma to individual cases. It would not, he added, almost as an afterthought, be nearly enough to have a plasma-based treatment if we had a major outbreak. At this point, Bress says that science around Ebola is still uncertain. He even says it may be like the plague. It's possibly associated with rats. And he says we have to wait really for the next outbreak to be confident about what Ebola is about. So that's the first sort of image that's there in the 1970s. Very local, very endemic. That's the way the Western press portrays it. But the ways in which it's seen as an international crisis is more in terms of a biosecurity issue in the 1970s. And press reports at this time, Ebola is made out to be a pervasive sort of threat, and it's associated with the Russian biological warfare programs. It's put together with threats like smallpox and hemorrhagic viruses such as Ebola and Lassa fever are seen to have similar kinds of pathologies. And preparedness at an international level is very much focused on biosecurity and really at containing Russian biowarfare, possibly through the links of American experts and possibly European allies. And what strikes me always when I look at both these images is the utter invisibility, except as kind of handmaidens to this research, of some of the lowly officials in the ministry at Zaire, some of the people in Sudan, but you don't see any local people, you don't see most of the local scientists involved, and in a lot of the press reports that will come up now, which I'll quote, you'll see constantly this sense of Western science and a lack of co-option or participation in this exercise. The third image which was there at that point in many of these press reports is that Ebola fever didn't even kind of merit the preparedness which the CDC puts together in 1994 for the plague. Following an outbreak of a suspected pneumonic plague in India, about 50 deaths occurred, only 50. The CDC enhanced surveillance at US airports. It modified existing quarantine protocols and observed that there were 13 cases of suspected plague. In the case of Ebola in the 1990s, after receiving information that there was Ebola hemorrhagic fever in the Kikwit area or in Zaire, and after about 100 deaths occurred, all it did was to issue a routine travel alert notice and an advisory. The belief really was that Ebola could travel to the West. It had traveled through the Marburg virus cases, for instance, in Germany, but possibly the transition would be associated with the sorts of transmission that occurred through monkeys with the Reston outbreak in Virginia. I move now to 2014. We know that Ebola then reemerges. It causes the kind of devastation we've been discussing now in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. And this clearly is now an era in global health when the politics of infectious disease have really changed. They're now mediated by the experience, as all of you would know, of HIV/AIDS, by the experience in particular of neoliberal reforms that led to the rollback of public funding for health services and disease priorities in many of these areas. And the WHO's focus also shifts. Post-plague and post-SARS, seeing itself as an agency that does global preparedness in terms of global surveillance. So it then sets up in 2000 the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, as all of you would know, and it becomes an overarching axis. But the local and the regional and the national, in many ways, get left behind in terms of the structural reforms that are happening, and they're left to countries to keep or to roll back. That happens in the 1990s. Now, what's happening in terms of the reports in the media in Western Africa? When you look at the recent reports, you find that in Western Africa, reports in the media from the nations affected by the outbreak have argued that Ebola is not an African, Liberian, or a Guinean problem, but a global challenge. And being a historian of global health, what I've been interested in is what do all these people mean by the global? And what I'm trying to say and argue is really that many people talk about Ebola as a global challenge, but we see it's a very elusive word. People refer to the global by talking about it with various kinds of politics. So the statements in Western Africa refer to Ebola as a global problem, as a part of the manifestations, really, of global health. However, we'll see when we look at some of the media reports amongst other African neighbor countries, we see that initially there's a kind of solidarity with the affected nations in Western Africa, but increasingly domestic preoccupations and national concerns have really complicated this kind of solidarity of what is really the global. In South Africa, for instance, the press soon suggests that South Africa is really exceptional within Africa itself. Initially, when the media takes interest in Ebola in West Africa in early April, the South African government sends its condolences to Guinea. There isn't much of an indication at this point of time in April 2014 that South Africa is worried about its own well-being or security at this point of time. By August, you find that fears have heightened with the arrival of several potential cases. And the overall media response from that point reflects this very complex notion of South African exceptionalism and the self-perception of South Africa not really being in Africa. Simultaneously, South Africa projects itself as a kind of savior. The South African Times on 22nd September in an editorial says, "The African Union cannot sit back and watch as the West leads the effort to solve yet another African crisis. South Africa plays a leading role in peacekeeping in Africa, and it is a continental business powerhouse. It is fitting that we are now putting together our considerable medical expertise and resources to use to save lives and fight this scourge." Let's move to East Africa. In East Africa, countries such as Kenya the press in Kenya, especially around August, increasingly begins to talk about the kind of panic there is among citizens in Sierra Leone. Kenya is seen as a kind of exception. While fear engulfs Sierra Leone, reports the Kenyan press, vigilant surveillance within Kenya is the only way out. In a tweet, the Kenyan National Disaster Operations Center says that port health officers are on standby and are vigilant as the virus spreads across West African countries. So science and surveillance is seen as something that's now in the control of the National Disaster Operations Center. But simultaneously, when the crisis deepens, you find that these kinds of mechanisms are accompanied by the sorts of fear and distrust of closing borders, especially the landed borders. And the Kenyan newspaper, the Daily Nation, in August, reports that residents along the borders of Kenya need to cooperate with the government in terms of identifying all the strangers who are entering the country. Later on, by October, you see Kenya and many East African nations turning to regional solidarities. There's the need, they say, for regional cooperation to bolster preparedness through East African countries and the need to present a united front. The New Times in Kigali on 19th October says, during their brainstorming session with the business community, the presidents of Kenya and Rwanda agreed that the West African experience provides lessons for us to increase preparedness. In Sierra Leone, everyone is running and panicking from Ebola. The East African leaders and the East African countries as a region should be asking, how do we keep investors by our side in bad times such as these? So it's a question of how do we keep business on our side. In Asia, I found, when I was looking at news reports, both in China and India, two sets of responses. There is, on the one hand, an immediate frontier within that needed preparedness, and I mean within India and within China itself. Experts argued that they needed to think about surveillance and controlling panic within these countries through national vigilance surveillance. And in the case of India, particularly, they were citing the Nigerian model of patient tracking based on its existing network of surveillance based on polio. And in the case of China and Singapore, for instance, the historical memory of surveillance is constantly evoking the SARS crisis. So China and India veer both, on the one hand, between stigmatized images of West African societies, their immigrants on the one hand, and also between assuming the mantle of regional leadership of the global South-based dominance. The Chinese media in particular articulated a need for China to assert itself in terms of the Ebola crisis. They reflected a tension that wishing to highlight, in fact, that China had a kind of old connectedness to Africa, but it hadn't only profited from trade in Africa, but also saw a humanitarian mission within Africa itself. The Shanghai Daily reported on October 2nd that the Chinese premier urges more aid to fight Ebola. Since Ebola's outbreak in West Africa in February, China has delivered humanitarian aid swiftly, offering multiple batches of emergency assistance, dispatching nearly 200 experts and workers. And in August, China delivered by air a patch of humanitarian aid worth 30 million RMB or 5 million. Chinese newspapers highlighted that China's foreign ministry had announced for the first time its decision to send an elite unit from the PLA to Liberia, making explicit comparisons with the squad's experience during the SARS crisis in 2002. On the other hand, the images of humanitarian assistance in China have also been colored by judgments about how the West has in some ways abandoned Africa. Hong Kong newspapers such as the South China Morning Post in October 2014 cautioned that fear bordering on hysteria is sweeping the US. But this is unwarranted in a country that has a sturdy healthcare system. Being alert and prepared amongst us will stop its spread. Hong Kong only needs to step up its vigilance. The director, for instance, of the China Foundation for International Studies, Cheng Tao, writes in the Global Times, what they, the Western countries and Japan, have done in Africa is not just failing to send charcoal in snowy weather, but to take away the firewood from under the cauldron. The internal frontier, I was talking about two sorts of lines. Within China itself, it sees a kind of crisis in terms of people who are already in China from Africa. The internal frontier in China is within Guangzhou itself. China's concerns in this debate focused increasingly on the African residents in Guangzhou. Newspaper debates reflected racial and immigration tensions, especially illegal immigration, and the Chinese government moves away from that entire humanitarian rhetoric to focus attention on the Guangdong province as the new Ebola front line that's located within China itself. It noted that there were 190 flights that connected Guangdong and Africa. A Nigerian trader in the Guangdong province says, Ebola has been a sensitive subject, given that many Africans were in Guangdong illegally and likely to avoid hospitals. Even in early November, there have been fears of an outbreak in Guangzhou that have persisted, with it being seen as the gateway for the entry and exit of African nationals. And finally, when I look at South Asia and the case of India, you see Ebola in the press constantly. The word used often is really not so much crisis or panic, but really as a scare. And there have been two sorts of responses, again, in India, in terms of Ebola being termed. Much of the press in India has said that India has really closed its door on Africa. It cancelled the biggest ever African summit, which is scheduled to be held in Delhi in December 2014. It's been scrapped by the government. And when foreign ministry officials were asked why they had done so, all they focused on was to say that India is making huge contributions to relieve the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. It's promised about $12.5 million, and it ranks one of the 5 most generous countries that have offered aid. But there's also an internal frontier here in terms of the critique that have emerged, that were there at the time of the plague crisis in India. So there's a kind of historical memory constantly of criticizing health preparedness within India itself. So the Indian Express actually says, in the season of the Ebola scare, national disaster agencies are adrift and headless. The worry is that Indian hospitals could turn into Ebola dissemination centers, since they are overburdened and chaotic as they are. Only 2 public centers in India can currently diagnose the disease, increasing the chances that the virus could go undetected, especially since it shares symptoms with dengue and typhoid, which will see a seasonal uptake. So the 2 points I want to build here is the fact that there is no background of freedom from infectious disease, neither in Africa, neither in parts of Asia. So to be able to monitor people just with that first touch of fever is extremely unlikely. There's never been that transition from infections to non-communicable diseases, and a kind of hubris that you could conquer all infections and then the reemergence of infectious diseases, the ways in which we see the history of public health here in the West. So there's this constant tension that the disease identity of Ebola itself is very much masked with an underlying with all the other infectious diseases that already exist. And the second thing I found really remarkable is that no one is talking about eradicating infectious diseases, which doesn't come up in any of this rhetoric, because there's an ongoing life and living with infections itself. So to sum up, I found that Ebola's disease identity, or its shift from the 1970s, from being local, endemic, and as a part of Africa's rural identity, is now being poised as a global health threat. But what we really need to understand is what do we mean by the complications of what is global? Histories and memories of past epidemics in various societies partly inform how people view this global health threat. There are also regional politics within the global south in terms of how India and China see itself. And most importantly, in terms of the science itself, press reports in Asia and Africa often note the path to safety, security, and recovery that has been guaranteed to airlifted missionaries, doctors, and first world citizens. The predominance of Western agencies and scientific facilities in accumulating and interpreting knowledge about Ebola has been a constant source of comment, implicating the science of emerging infections in what I see as the politics of the inequality of the science in global health. And I'll end with 2 quotations which I found had a lot of resonance for me. In the case of Ashok Mukpo, the Times of India notes that the US journalist Ashok Mukpo, who was evacuated from Liberia, was known as a reincarnated Tibetan Lama as an infant. He was named after the great Indian emperor Ashoka, and that he had dedicated himself to highlighting how the world was seemingly abandoning the people of Liberia. But as the deadly disease struck Ashok Mukpo, he was flown to Nebraska to one of the few advanced facilities in the US that is geared to treat Ebola only for a small elite group of people fortunate enough to have access. In a similar tone, the Daily Nation in Kenya noted, more seriously and importantly, the Ebola attack demonstrates what is our existential challenge. Those American missionaries who were infected by Ebola were flown home, and they were treated with an experimental drug that seemed to have worked. There are about 5 such medicines and vaccines being developed in the US, and although it faces virtually no risk of homegrown Ebola. However, it is noted that there is no such science and preparedness in Africa, and we have been reduced to criticizing the Americans for not doing enough to share their Ebola medicine. And finally, it says, we can build roads, we can build railways, we can build skyscrapers and oil pipelines, you name it, and we will do it. But until we do smart science and invest in knowledge and research, we shall still be rich sometime during this century, but we shall never rule this century. So I really feel that questions of science and panic and preparedness need to really weigh in to whom it is accessible and how we must really co-opt issues of public trust to determine the interpretations of for whom we have to address and how we will address their needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kavita. That was also a very interesting talk and a different perspective, and very, very helpful. And so we want to conclude with another aspect of this that I haven't really heard talked about very much at all in the many insufferable Ebola lessons learned things have already started. And I've asked Jeff Schlegelmilch, who is at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. He's Managing Director for Strategic Planning and Operations. And in addition to his public health degrees, has an MBA. And he's going to talk a little bit about the economic, and especially the private sector type of impact here, which is actually important with reference to sustainable development, and what is the consequence of a disaster like this on the economy of nations that are struggling. So, Jeff, would you come up?
Well, thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Irwin. Thank you to the Earth Institute for putting this on, and thanks to everyone for making it out on this Thursday night. I know back when Friends and Seinfeld was on Thursday night, we never could have gotten a crowd like this together, so I can only assume the quality of television has gone down somewhat. Yeah, as Irwin mentioned, I've kind of had my foot in a couple of worlds with disaster response. I started as an epidemiologist and a project manager with the Boston Public Health Commission, and then did some work in sort of a quasi-consulting environment. And in that time, went after my MBA, and in going through this coursework, looking at supply chain management and shareholder value propositions, while then, during my day job, actually working on disaster response and things like that, it was really interesting to look at the overlap on how congruent some of these processes were, and how these efficient mechanisms of doing business and these capabilities of the business community could really apply to public health and disaster response. And it was Hurricane Katrina that opened my eyes a lot in comparing the FEMA response to the Walmart response. And so FEMA really took on, I think, what would be probably a stereotypical corporate response, where they were trying to centralize everything and, in a sense, really delayed a lot of things and create a lot of inefficiencies by trying to create relationships on the fly that were very structured and centralized, whereas the Walmart response, which was probably more typical of a corporate response, was what's the most efficient way to meet the objective. They became very decentralized and gave their individual store managers an incredible amount of latitude to, quote, do what is right. And both are written up fairly extensively, but I think it really also goes to show kind of what the power of the private sector is, both as as a potential responder and a force multiplier for the public objectives of disaster response. And so why public-private partnerships? This is a term that's used a lot in the Homeland Security vernacular. And I think first, this first quote, that the actual work of responding and recovering from disasters is from a myriad of players, right? It's from government agencies, private sector companies, nonprofit organizations, and the actual impacted citizens. And acting within those industry or sector silos comes across as unresponsive, poorly communicated, and just riddled with bureaucracy. And that's another point that I want to make, too, is that, you know, in Hurricane Katrina, FEMA as an institution got a lot of criticism, but there were a lot of really hardworking people on the ground responding, working under perhaps an inefficient and system that needed to be reworked. But there are a lot of individuals doing good work that doesn't contribute to a greater good because it's structured inappropriately. And I think that's what that gets at. And then the other piece, I don't speak too much to this next one here, but I just want to point it out. It's from an article called Imperfect Federalism. And it's a really important viewpoint. It talks about when Congress disperses funds to states and localities, the politics of distribution usually take higher precedence over targeting need. And that's just a reality of a federal appropriations process, right? We have appropriations committees that have representatives from states that get elected on there through politicized processes. And it's not the most efficient way of saying, what does the science say we need? Okay, match it, everybody vote, right? There's all kinds of other things added on, and it's not to say that it's not useful, and in fact, it's incredibly important that that's there, but it's not complete. And so without it, it creates blind spots because the visibility is so high at the federal level. And so it needs to be supplemented by the full range of economic resources available to the nation that goes far beyond just those appropriated by the federal government from tax dollars. So I was looking around for a good graphic to put up here so you guys could look at something while zoning out. And and what I liked about this is actually even more so about what it says is where I found it. Thank God for search engines, by the way. I got this in the International Journal of Physical Distribution and Logistics Management. Any folks big readers, subscribers? So, no, and obviously, it's obviously a very specific trade journal, but to find something this explicit on disaster preparedness in a supply chain journal, it's just, there's a lot of really important thinking going on in the private sector. And it's you know, some of it's out of altruism, some of it's out of, you know, looking at how do we make life better for everyone, but some of it too is this speaks to the core of creating shareholder value, of having efficient businesses that give people jobs, that keeps economic activity flowing. It's about more than altruism, and that's okay. And really what this speaks to, going from left to right, is you have these public-private partnerships, and they're kind of probably best understood through the supply chain. And because that's really, emergency management is a logistics game. It's about getting stuff to people who need stuff. And sometimes you need people with the stuff to get to the people who need the stuff. You with me? Okay. And then we talk about critical infrastructure and key resources, or CIKR, because acronyms help us sufficiently confuse the issue. But but that's sort of a recognition. Power, transportation, water, all of these are highly privatized. There's so much stuff about the way we live our lives that's outside of the operations of government. And that's a good thing, right? That's it creates more efficiencies. It's more focused on the mission at hand. But in a time of a disaster, if it's not functioning properly, it becomes a big barrier to actually having the economic and social resilience within the community itself. And finally, I want to talk just a little bit, because there was some very interesting research done on pooling risk. And this becomes particularly important when we're talking about sustainability. And so this is a good example. This study took a look at the costs of the disaster safety nets for developing countries, as well as developed countries, and those public-private partnerships. This is focused on insurance. So on the far, I guess, stage right, house left, your left, is the Northridge earthquake in California. So California has a very interesting earthquake insurance, which is kind of has an analog in national insurance, where it's the risk is borne by the government, but it's administered by the private sector. And actually, this article sort of looks for an international paradigm for doing that. But what you can see there is there's about a 50% economic loss, non-reimbursed loss. And then about 35% of that is covered by this insurance, by this sort of planned risk mechanism. And then that little chunk in between through state aid. You see, for the next three, the Kobe earthquake, the Umbria earthquake, and the Poland floods, less of a mechanism for the insurance sector to come in. So you see a much larger proportion of that being handled by the state and being borne by the state to go in there and actually absorb the costs of that, because the risk pool is very poorly defined outside of the government. England, the Easter floods, that's an interesting one because it was almost entirely absorbed by insured losses. There really was no state aid, although I should note for each of these, the authors removed any sort of state property from that sort of calculation, so roads, municipal buildings, things like that. And then in the Sudanese floods, you have over 80% of it is just an economic loss, and the state aid that does flow through is mostly through international aid and things like that. So that becomes really important when we talk about vulnerability, is that you have these low-income countries that have very little capacity for state aid, that no insurance or risk pooling mechanism, yet have a lion's share of the fatalities per event and the direct economic losses as a share of income. So you have a disproportional share of loss in an environment where you just don't have as much room for loss. You know, from this, in developing and impoverished environments, the risk pooling is done extensively on kinship relations, really done within the community. And actually, community resilience is emerging as a really cool, really exciting area in disaster preparedness research, and the power of communities and the power of things like barbecues and church picnics to actually make communities more resilient and create social capital. The problem with risk pooling is that when you have a disaster that impacts the entire community, there's nowhere to bring in resources. The entire pool has been affected. And so the role of corporations in that oftentimes can sort of extend that risk pool beyond that. So bringing it to Ebola and the private sector. The rest of this, I just kind of took a couple of snippets of a couple of case studies, some examples of how corporations or the private sector are dealing with the Ebola issue. What are those public-private partnerships, and what are kind of the shared values? What's the value proposition for shareholders or for the corporate environment, and what's the value proposition for public health? And are there lessons here to be learned to replicate that, sort of scale that up for future disasters? I'm not really going to talk about corporate donations and things like that. I think those are very, very important, but they're sort of a different animal in and of themselves. So the first one that we've been listening to a lot is the pharmaceutical development, right? We have a lot of vaccines under development. We have a lot of possible antiviral treatments under development. This has been a very interesting industry to watch post 9/11. There's not a lot of money in vaccines for things that we know we're going to have, like the flu. So then to develop a vaccine for something we may or may not need, it's very difficult to build that business case for doing that. And so that's one of the challenges of having enough drugs in the pipeline to do it. And you're looking at research and development pipelines of 25 years or more in some cases. And the same thing on the pharmaceutical side, and then to go through the testing processes, the safety testing and then the efficacy testings, especially if it's a rare event like Ebola. So what we've seen is looking at the broader scope of infectious disease is the FDA putting in mechanisms and the federal government through legislation and other mechanisms, ways to rapidly test and approve pharmaceuticals for use. And we'll talk a little bit about the value of that in a little bit, but it gives a little bit of a trade-off. It shortens the time frame a little bit of getting potentially viable pharmaceuticals to market, but it doesn't completely eliminate that ramp-up time, right? But it does, like I said, take away some of the barriers for these pharmaceutical companies to sort of play in this game and to actually do this and to have a little bit less risk involved if there's a little more information. And I think that's one of the key things when thinking about the private sector is with strategic planning, you have to make commitments, but you don't have the information you need to know if that commitment's going to pay off or not. And that's probably most pronounced in the pharmaceutical industry, where you don't know what tomorrow's pandemic is going to be, but you have to start researching it 10 years ago to be able to mount an effective response. And then the other piece, in the absence of effective pharmaceuticals in a sufficient quantity, which we're probably 6 months to a year from under the best case scenarios, the actual gear, right? So we're looking at completely covering up, right? If there's, so here's a couple of companies here. DQE, they make some of those full body suits, the yellow ones that you see here. They've doubled their production staff. Demand is 10 to 20 times over the same period last year, and there's a 12-week backlog for full body suits. Medline has 72% of the market for surgical gowns. They're getting about 150 calls a day about this. DuPont has tripled production of their Tychem suits. Kimberly-Clark is staging materials and production lines ahead of anticipated demand. During H1N1, you know how many factories in the United States produced N95 masks? Just one. Because, production facilities, supply chain, it's just in time. We're on a just-in-time inventory system. I remember in our pandemic flu planning, one of our planners would say, I challenge you to go to a grocery store and not find somebody stocking the shelves, right? And that's normally a good thing. It means we can get stuff cheaper, right? But then the problem is when we need a lot more than we normally need in a very short period of time. And so what we're seeing here is actually with these sort of global manufacturing capabilities, you don't have one factory that needs to ramp up 20 times. You have a network of them to ramp up. Honestly, I think a 12-week backlog for full body suits is not that unreasonable, that's probably not too bad of a job that they're doing with that. I don't know what the daily demand is for full body suits, but I suspect that every hospital ordering a stockpile simultaneously puts a bit of a strain on the day-to-day. Well, actually, I guess I can say it's 10 to 20 times less than what it is now, right? Okay. So, but what does all that mean, right? What is having these partnerships in place, having mechanisms to have to be able to procure them quickly, to bring companies in on the process early on when there's an anticipated need, and to remove the barriers to getting things certified and deployed in the field quickly. From the public health side, the value there is it increases the pipeline of supplies and the potential ability to surge in a time of need. That creates a steady research and development stream. This has probably been one of the more contentious, although less public, aspects of bioterrorism preparedness, is the federal government's role in bearing the risk of research and development, investing in that, because it's a very costly endeavor. But then with the research and development stream, you have evidence-based countermeasures. You have a surge capacity for manufacturing, and you have efficient procurement vehicles. Now, for shareholders on the corporate value, you're mitigating uncertainty for the product development. You're more likely to have a market for what you're developing if you have these agreements in place and you've got agreements with the FDA for approval. You also have a competitive advantage in emergency situations. And that's really how risk is managed in the private sector, right? If you have a riskier investment, you're expecting a higher return on it. And so as a citizen, I'm okay if there are some companies that are willing to put a little more risk into it to have that competitive advantage in an emergency situation, although that's certainly a topic for debate. And I don't mean to say that everything that corporations do is all great, and I especially don't mean to say that at Columbia University. So, but there's also an opportunity cost. Having somebody want to buy something from you and not being able to sell it to them is an incredibly traumatic event for a corporation. I used to work at a coffee chain all through college, and people would come in, and we sold coffee. That's what we did. And if we messed it up and we didn't have it brewing, and somebody came in and said, "I need coffee," I said, "We don't have any." I mean, what are we doing? Right? Okay. All right, so let's talk about Firestone in Liberia. So again, I don't mean to go back and say, that everything that's ever been done at this plantation in Liberia is good. I just don't know enough to know what I don't know. And so there is more baggage with these public-private partnerships that needs to be articulated. But again, what's working right? Let's talk about that. So while the Liberian Senate was arguing about whether or not Ebola was just a ploy to get more foreign aid, Firestone went into action. They took their administrative staff and created this Ebola war room and set up through their hospital their 2 isolation clinics. They started taking pickup trucks, converting them into ambulances. They took their agricultural surveys and turned them into epidemiologists. So there were all kinds of things. They started to look at what is the function we need performed and who do we have that's capable of doing that. So what's happened is you actually have villages around the plantation that are essentially being wiped out by Ebola. And since early October, there have been no additional cases since the initial discovery of Ebola within the plantation. They're responsible for 8,500 employees and opened it up to about 71,500. So that's 80,000 people that have been removed from the cohort where Ebola is spreading. Those are some serious numbers. Now, it becomes controversial because the way that corporations draw their boundaries are different than political boundaries. So what happens if you're not a dependent, but you're nearby and you have it? And they've turned people away. And only until after really stopping the transmission within their corporate community have they started to open it up to the communities around them and bring them in. But there is a very measured approach to doing that. But again, in looking at the value, the public health value is here you have a significant population that's being covered by a functioning healthcare system. And you don't have to pay for it. You don't have to manage it. You just have to let it work, right? You have reduced morbidity and mortality. That's probably the ultimate public health measure. And you're also getting additional information on best practices that contribute to the broader response. You have successful treatment of cases, successful stopping of transmission. That's incredibly important to other areas. What you have here, the shareholder value, corporate image has become an increasingly central piece of how companies are valued. And that really comes from activism and groups banding together and really not accepting anything less than responsible corporate governance. You have reduced worker turnover and time away. So actually the civil war that occurred for over a decade in Liberia set back the production of this rubber plantation. It'll be 2032, I think that was the date. But it'll be several decades before they're able to be at the pre-war production levels. So then you throw an Ebola outbreak on top of that. I mean, that plays into your strategic planning, right? So it's so you're really mitigating against decreased productivity and a further erosion of the resource. And you're also containing the containment of the outbreak leads to the restoration of economic activity. The free flow of money and goods and services is something that the private sector loves to see. And you know what? Public health likes to see that as well, too. When people are working, when economies are growing, there's more resources to do things. Everybody's happy. So now here's one that's near and dear to my heart, chocolate. So this was... in kind of putting this presentation together, I think this was the example that really first caught my eye, although there's been a tremendous amount of coverage of a lot of different aspects. Ivory Coast and Ghana produce 60% of the world's cocoa. Not a single confirmed case of Ebola in either country, but the cocoa futures are through the roof. And so the reason for this is obviously there's a lot of concern of what it would do to the markets if there was a case, but it's also the way that the farming practices are. It's a lot of small farms where the buyers go from farm to farm, in some cases by bicycle, and sort of aggregate it, and then it's a couple of iterations of that before it makes it, onto the truck into the Hershey factory in Pennsylvania. So even having a couple of cases and disrupting movement really severely disrupts the supply of cocoa to the rest of the world. So you probably won't get Ebola, but you will pay more for your M&Ms. But the cocoa farmers and seeing this, so this isn't just the financial markets and the commodity markets sort of looking at this and anticipating a money-making opportunity or a potential threat to production. The cocoa farmers themselves are looking at this, and they're actually increasing production in anticipation of a disruption. If they have to stop doing, can they push out more now so that if there is a case and there is disruption, that they're able to have enough cash reserves to keep people on the payroll and keep things going. I'm sure it doesn't hurt that they're also getting higher prices right now than they would at other times. But you're also seeing the cocoa farmers coming together and donating to the Ebola response. So there's a number of activities that's going on where it hasn't even begun to affect them yet, but the threat to the livelihood is so well understood that they're taking direct actions to prevent it from disrupting. And if that happens, that's really the best case because they're able to help stop the outbreak, maintain stability with the market, and take advantage of higher prices in the near term with the concern that it's costing. Not that I would ever suggest that it's a good thing to have higher prices because of disease outbreak or people dying. So The public health value, you have additional resources to combat Ebola. You have a force multiplier with additional private sector stakeholders. You have more eyes on prevention, more people buying into prevention and keeping it from entering these areas. You have better messaging. They're actually messaging a lot like, hey, you can't get Ebola from eating chocolate, right? It's good to know. And they're also, in terms of, again, sustaining the economic activity, you're mitigating against the poverty-based amplifiers of disease. Shareholder value, obviously you're selling at higher prices. You're preventing the loss of production due to quarantine, due to morbidity and mortality, or even just due to perception. And you're preventing the erosion of resources, both the human resources and the agricultural resources and I don't mean to make very clinical of the human resources. So finally, I want to talk to, it's just some really interesting stuff that's coming out of the insurance sector. And this kind of comes back up to the risk pooling we talked about before. So they're coming out with pandemic disease business interruption coverage. So this is insurance for lost revenue for a non-physical damage event. And it's for voluntary or involuntary quarantine of facilities or medical professionals. This is a hospital in Massachusetts where they had, I believe they had someone who they thought had Ebola but didn't have it. So again, businesses are looking at reducing that uncertainty with what if they have to stop things? What if they have to shut down a wing? And hospitals in particular that tend to work on razor-thin margins and are dealing with their own issues with the consolidation of the healthcare industry. This can be critically important. It also protects revenues in the event of a quarantine. So you have the public health value is you're mitigating the cost of a quarantine to government and individuals. This goes back to that original one. It's not the government who has to pay out. It's a risk pool that's established through the private sector. It keeps the cost and the active response in the private sector where the need is. It also increases the individual's likelihood to comply with quarantine. And this is a really important point that when we tell somebody, you need to stay at home for 21 days, if you're an hourly employee living paycheck to paycheck, that's a very difficult thing to do. And a lot of people are in a situation where they can't stay home for 21 days. And to be able to have that ability as an organization to have your employees stay home to comply with this increases the likelihood that cases will be stopped through these mechanisms. So just to kind of sum up a little bit, public interest and shareholder values are not mutually exclusive endeavors. A lot of times the objectives can lead to the same public benefit. And I think it's important that we understand that. Because when we talk public-private partnerships, a lot of times we think of memorandums of understanding or other legal mechanisms that define the parameters of a relationship. But actually the effectiveness of the response comes from trust, which comes from informal relationships, responding together, knowing each other, having that implied trust of doing things. And so starting from understanding where those values overlap, I think is critical to building that. Government funding and corporate donations are only part of the broader response requirements. As we've seen, the private sector actually manages a lot of the operations of how we do things every day. And so being able to continue to do that becomes critically important. The private sector is both a principal responder and a victim of the disaster at the same time. And finally, the nature of transnational corporations creates alternatives to the traditional risk pooling paradigms. Instead of working within political boundaries, you now have truly global boundaries, although they do draw borders within borders, as we saw with the Firestone example in Liberia. So that does sort of require a little bit deeper understanding for how to optimize that. So I think I've talked enough for now, and I'll hand it back to Irwin. Thank you.
Really interesting, Jeff. Thank you very much for that, and adds a whole other dimension to these discussions that we're having, and really rounds out what we think about when we think about a disaster like Ebola or other kinds of disasters that do not respect the boundaries between the private sector, the public sector, the needs of human beings, and so forth. So that was great. So now we have some time now. We'd like to really engage all of you. If you have a question, just if you guys can come up here. And then if you have a question, just raise your hand and somebody will bring you a microphone because we want to capture your comments. And so have at it. Anything's fair game here. So anybody? Yes.
Hello. Thank you for such a great discussion about the politics and implications of Ebola. What I'm curious about is thinking about those nations in West Africa based on what we have learned from previous crises and the history of what is the legacy of each of these emergencies. If you could speculate about what will be the legacy of Ebola in terms of how those nations that are affected will change their infrastructure, or if we will begin to think about community health in a different way after this experience.
Well, let me say a word about that. There's, I think, an insufficiently recognized relationship between resiliency and, at the spectrum of resiliency to vulnerability, which is actually critical for sustainable development, that's fully incorporated into the thinking about sustainable development in under-resourced countries. The disaster reality wreaks havoc, really, when it comes to progress that might be. It's like you're making progress, and all of a sudden you have a civil war. You have a disruption of a positive process of growth and development, which is long, it's fragile in the beginning, and war suddenly kind of pulls the legs out from under progress being made. Big disasters do the same thing, and they do it all over the world, even in developed countries. Katrina was a wreckage for the reality of what New Orleans was, for example. They lost 100,000 people that have left New Orleans and never come back. The lower ninth is still a mess. The economy is struggling there, even though the rest of the state is maybe doing better. It's how do we sort of recognize the impact of a disaster and what needs to happen to make it resilient? And then it brings up the question, well, what disasters are we going to try to defend against by improving resiliency to disasters in a particular country? And maybe this has something to do with the state of development and the state of resilience in Nigeria, let's say, compared to Liberia or Sierra Leone or wherever else the disease is having its way. So I think there's a big relationship, and I think improving the resiliency toward resiliency to disasters actually should be part of the process in an overt way when we're thinking about sustainable development of a struggling economy. But does anyone else want to?
I had a comment, which is that, some of these societies are exceptional. They don't even tie up with, the realities there are not even similar to many other emerging economies or other developing countries. Many of these societies are undergoing what's happening partly because of a lack of a state. The Médecins Sans Frontières are pretty much the Ministry of Health. For polio programs, for so many other things, the state really depends upon them. So if you see some of the research on Liberia and Guinea and other places, that's what you see. So, unless you have unless governance has a structure, unless you have a political infrastructure in place, I don't even know about trying to predict how you would actually plan public health measures. And the other issue that comes up often in global health is that it's not so much the lack of public health resources, but the wrong kinds of priorities. What's happened is the dismantling really of core public health programs, core health services. And so it's not only preparedness for Ebola, but just putting into place routine kinds of health services, which is what I think when I speak about the studies that were done in 1977 and 79, they say we can actually contain some of this in hospitals and within families, but you need to have that basic health infrastructure. But if the state itself is a kind of vacuum in some ways, then you really have to rebuild society both in terms of that infrastructure as well. And I think that's emerging after years of civil war, decades of it. Yeah.
Yes.
There was a lot. It's very interesting. But I wanted to ask, both from the standpoint of crisis versus panic, and the chart you showed about that it looked like the panic went down until people got the idea they were being lied to in some way, that it wasn't accurate, and then the whole international aspect of this thing. It seems to me that the thing that was shocking about the Ebola question was the fact that Doctors Without Borders had to beg for help, and that it kept building and building and building, and there was really no serious response. And that this is currently still the situation. Now, I work with the Executive Intelligence Review. Our Political Action Committee has put forward a call for a war on Ebola and international mobilization. And we quote Dr. Osterholm, who himself has said, number one, we've got to get the supplies there. I mean, it's just outrageous at this point that you haven't had this. And he's called for a Berlin airlift-style mobilization to get the necessary supplies in. Two is we've added to it getting Navy health ships. I mean, there's 1,000 beds plus personnel on each ship that could massively increase the capability of putting people into isolation and decreasing the rate of infection. And then the third thing that we've called for this is an international steering committee. So I was really interested in what you talked about, because you don't get the press coverage from Kenya to South Africa here about what people are saying. But what we have called for is an international steering committee, that there be a real coordination of efforts with Russia, China, the United States. I mean, obviously Cuba's doing, quite a bit, but that this move on that level. And then the last thing, in terms of the preparedness domestically, I mean, the charts you've shown about 50,000 health workers losing their jobs since 2008, it seems to me the other thing is the number of hospitals that have shut down. I mean, here we have St. Vincent's here that was really critical for AIDS, which is infectious disease. We had tried to stop the shutdown of DC General Hospital, which had one of the only decontamination units in the country. And when anthrax hit, people were in the parking lot because they had actually shut the hospital. So the last thing on that, in terms of which I'd like to ask you in terms of preparedness, when you say, well, how do we know what we have to prepare for, is wouldn't it be the case that if there was a real national mobilization to rebuild medical infrastructure along the lines of the Hill-Burton requirements, how many hospitals per capita, per unit area, that you have a concept of preparedness, which we don't have now because now we have insurance. So what? You have an insurance policy. You don't have a hospital. It really doesn't do anything. So these are my questions. And in terms of the underlying question is, if these things are true, we should have a mobilization of equipment. We should have beds. We should actually deal with the spread. There should be an international coordination. How do we get the political structure in the United States to go for that? Yeah. Because most of the conferences I've gone to on Ebola are not called for by the politicians. They're 1199. It's the Hospital Association. It's doctors. How do you get political support? And my suggestion is that if you tie the idea of rebuilding American medical infrastructure with the idea that our health is related to the health of West Africa, that it's not separate, and you have a long-term sense of that, like what Jeff Sachs talked about getting public health into Liberia and these different countries, from a longer-term standpoint, that this would be a way to go about it. So that's kind of a broad question. Yeah, I'm hitting at all the speakers because they were all very interesting, but that's what I would like to know. How do we actually mobilize?
Yeah, it was a great question. I'll take a step first, but maybe it would be good to go down the line here because they're very insightful questions. I'm going to answer a question that Jeff should answer, but I'm very intrigued by this whole concept. So, you remember the BP oil spill, which was managed as a problem, like the Fukushima situation, by some kind of indecipherable, quote-unquote, collaboration between the private sector that owned the facility and had basically had all the expertise in how to stop the leak, and the U.S. government, which Thad Allen from the Coast Guard was appointed by the president to be the czar of the response. That happened. TEPCO versus the government of Japan. The same exact kind of confusion, mixed messages, a lot of incompetence all over the place. And I'm saying that because I think we have work to do in understanding one of Jeff's key points here, that the wall this is just one aspect of one of your questions, but the wall between the private sector, which has the resources, and the public sector and the public good, they have to be dealt with in some kind of way. We don't really have a mechanism for doing that. When I was doing the commission that Peter mentioned for Governor Cuomo was after Sandy, one of the questions was, how do you deal with the gas shortage? What do I need to do? What does the governor need to do? Well, there's a limit to what the governor could do, because about 88% of everything to do with a gas station on your block functioning is in the control of the private sector. And it's very complicated to get from the refineries in the Gulf to the gas pump by your house is going through many state jurisdictions. There are private trucks, private companies, private refineries. And there you have the government actually having the formal responsibility for dealing with it. I don't really know the answer to it, but let me just skip to Jeff for a second, just to deal with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the underlying issues with disaster response is that it's inherently political, but it's also cross-sectoral. I didn't think through that word, but it goes across sectors. So it's we like to. I appreciated Amy your point on how we like to kind of shield ourselves with the science and try and push out the politics and trying to deny the influence of the politics. When the reality is that that's an extremely real part about the efficiency of response, and that a very astute politician has the ability to pull together the machinery of the public sector and the machinery of the private sector. And I think that's what we saw with the appointment of the Ebola czar. And I think that's why, maybe it seemed a little funny not to have a physician do it. But in practice now, getting sort of a mechanic in there to bring those different pieces together to get everything running smoothly. It's what we saw with actually Thad Allen's appointment with the BP oil spill too. It wasn't for lack of the right people at the table. It was for the lack of the political leadership that could translate the interest to the private sector participants, the political participants, and the scientific participants to meet that objective in a very disciplined fashion. So I think there's something to be said for being able to balance the values across different sectors. Even if ultimately the objective is humanitarian, it may need to be articulated in ways that are particularly salient to the various stakeholders who you need to get to the table to make things work. So.
Amy, did you want to?
Well, I think you asked the question that we all have in some way and are trying to answer, but I think one of the things that I found myself asking is sort of, why is our threshold set so low? Like it was the second nurse in Texas, right? That in my mind has triggered everything. So why, an epidemic of 2 is, as Irwin started out by saying, we have 36,000 deaths from influenza a year. So why an epidemic of 2? And I think as I'm thinking about it, you think about sort of the post-World War II period, the rise of international institutions, and all of this talk about sort of how the world owns the epidemics, and the United States and the World Health Organization and the CDC have to be just as concerned about outbreaks in Africa as we have to be concerned about the United States. So why does that break down in the case of Ebola? And to me, I found Kavita's talk particularly illuminating, that it's this early construction of Ebola as something that's very local, that for which there isn't. One of the things I was struck by in rereading Laurie Garrett's book and rereading her chapter on Ebola over the past week was a WHO statement that was made after 1976. So this was even before the WHO statement you were talking about. We don't know how it spread. There is no way we can prepare for Ebola. The only I think sort of part of it is rooted in not just in the way we regard African diseases, but in the particular history of Ebola itself, and I think in an American sense, and you saw this at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic too, right? Sort of this effort to it's a Haitian disease, it's an African disease, it's trying to cast ownership of the disease outside of our borders in some way that contributes to this notion that we can seal off our borders rather than seeing ourselves as part of an interconnected global world.
So, Kavita, and I also sort of was thinking about what you what you talked about as well. I just want to mention that in terms of how and why we don't get government more engaged in actually fixing this, I think it would be wrong not to at least note the fact that there's a lot of ideology and other things that are not that pleasant to understand about, especially a disease that occurs in Africa and other parts of the developing world, don't necessarily rise to the level of, unless it's the fear that's taken over about Ebola, it's really over there in a way that's, you know, it's part of the reality and the formula that makes us disconnect really from solving some of these global problems. But please.
I mean, I think there's a sense, like Amy was saying, that we draw all these kind of boundaries and maps. In the sometime in the late 1950s, WHO epidemiologists begin to redraw the maps, for instance, for the plague. So it's no longer so all these kind of, the plague is no longer something that's sort of visible and going to cause outbreaks, but there's this whole discourse about what is endemic, that you don't really know when a disease is going to spring out again, but there's a belief that it's rooted only in some sites. So I think that's really something that was enduring even in the 1970s and 80s, that these are the sites where it's going to stay. It's riding on whatever these gerbils or insects or monkeys or whatever else, and it's not going to do this jump. So that was, so that, yeah. So that was true for the plague. The second comment I had was, I think with Ebola, there's also kind of hope in the ways in which Nigeria, for instance, had an approach based on polio. And I think it's important to note that there has been a precedent, even in poorer countries, of being able to tail people, have good systems of surveillance without having a hugely expensive infrastructure. So both tuberculosis as well as polio are good instances of how poorer countries can actually build up a public health infrastructure. Except that, it's the way global health funds move. Like recently, if you even look at articles in The Lancet, the last 7-8 years, most of the articles about challenges in developing countries, which Richard Horton himself personally edits, are all about non-communicable diseases. So there's kind of this shift which happened also, that infections are not as important, and that developing countries now have this huge whammy of a burden of these diseases. So it kind of makes me feel that global health is again going to have this tension between this competition for funds. Those people who are in charge of these diabetes, cardiovascular disease are not going to go away. So the moment there's ebbs, you again have this conflict for resources instead of building health services which are good for both. So I think that's the kind of, you and me and this disease and another disease, and not kind of seeing the connections, I think.
Good points. We have just a few minutes left, unless you want to extend to midnight, which I told you. Why don't we take another question, or maybe if it's short, we'll take two, but over here.
Thank you all very much for your presentations. I am a librarian, so this topic is very close to my heart. I was wondering if you could answer, please, how ethical or unethical you believe the CDC have been in their response to the epidemic, both nationally and internationally.
Ethical or unethical in what way? In terms of
their response to the epidemic.
In terms of communication, in terms of quarantine measures, or sort of you thinking about all of these?
Right. In terms of treatment care.
In terms of treatment. In terms of sort of the availability of Western medicines
exactly.
in African nations. I mean, I think that's a really good question. Unfortunately, that's not part of sort of the kind of my take on ethics. I feel like that's a medical ethics question, but I know that one of the very first things that WHO did in the early, that was obviously a point of critique, but they drew together an ethics committee to answer this question of should we try these experimental drugs in African settings. Of course, it's a very sensitive question given the debates that we had over the 076 trials when we were beginning to develop medicines for HIV. And the argument there was, well, you can't put anything into an experimental trial in another country that you couldn't do in this country. So you can't search for cheaper medicines. You can't short circuit the Western rules of research. And what the ethics committee found there was, they determined that in fact we have a moral imperative to do it even if we're uncertain. But I think sort of the most troubling thing is, and I don't know that this is just the CDC, and this goes back to some of the points Jeff was making, that there's sort of, and there are networks of players here, and the revelations that you've had pharmaceutical companies that have had things in development that haven't been able to move them forward. I think it speaks to maybe the ethics of capitalism and sort of what drives, the point Jeff made, that in order to do strategic planning, you have to invest the money now, and it reminds me of sort of the whole Thomas Piketty book that's becoming so popular now, and sort of his basic thesis there is that capitalism drives us towards inequity, and we have to tinker with capitalism. So I think it goes beyond sort of you're asking a question beyond narrow medical ethics, and really sort of what are the ethics of how can we not tinker with capitalism in some fashion in this epidemic?
Thanks.
I was just going to add too. I think it's really a fantastic question, because the yardstick for measuring ethics is oftentimes very different from the legal and sort of taxpayer development of a federal agency, right? And so I think the CDC in particular has this tremendous global capacity and capability that's really, through its creation, designed to protect the United States of America, its citizens, and its interests. And in doing so has been able to, expand that mission by, stopping outbreaks overseas in the guise of stopping them here. But when it comes down to very tactical decisions of who to give this one course of ZMAP to or something like that, it becomes very difficult to reconcile sort of the legal framework that allows for the response and the ethical yardstick through the various lenses that you're looking at. So I think it's fair to say that there are certain ethical lenses that are not congruent with the legal framework that these agencies were created under, and we could probably do a whole seminar on that as well too. And that's one thing where the private sector is able to sort of change things up in response to public opinion and public outrage. When you have legislative mandates and legislative legal sort of roots in what allows you to do what you do, it makes for some very difficult decisions to adhere to that, while maybe there's a desire to do something more. So it's
actually, this is about to get a lot worse, because when antivirals and vaccines start to come out, they're never going to suddenly appear at the scale that's needed globally, right? So there's going to be very, very difficult choices to be made that are just replete with ethical issues, moral issues, actual medical, public health concerns. And because what's going to happen is the antiviral medications, when they start being produced at larger scale, it's going to be a slow process. It won't be at the max, as I'm saying. And I think it actually would be good to have much more public discussion of this. When we were thinking about and planning for avian flu as a serious pandemic in the mid-2000s, there were ethical panels talking, because short supply of even ventilators, and we're just talking about in the U.S. now, we had about 1/7 of the amount of respirators, mechanical ventilators, that might be needed in a full-blown pandemic just in the U.S. now. And so a lot of discussions about, my grandmother is sick and she's on a ventilator, and now a 15-year-old comes in, is sick, needs that ventilator. How are we going to make decisions about, taking that off my grandmother and giving it to my nephew? It's very, very difficult, and basically a lot of unanswered questions in that, but a very important conversation.
Yeah, well, and add to that, I think one of the things that's interesting, so the CDC has a panel that makes decisions that the elderly and the very young are not going to get respirators, but there's a real reluctance to. I'm not pointing to you as elderly. I'm pointing to you as very young. Are not going to get respirators, but there's a
I'm
real.
sick of these young people.
but there's a real reluctance to have that discussion, and I think in part it's kind of the legacy of the political backlash over death panels and rationing that makes health officials shy away from being, I think, very forthcoming with the kinds of decisions that, frankly, the CDC has already has some preparedness on, and they know what they're going to do when we have a shortage of ventilators. They know who they're going to recommend that we give them to, but there hasn't been that public discussion about it.
Go ahead.
Just quickly, yeah, I think also the CDC doesn't have international accountability, right? Like the
Sort of like what Jeff was saying.
Yeah, so the WHO does. Neither does the European Union. They also have laboratories where they collect samples. So I think but the WHO would. So I think that's a good mediation, if they...
Yeah, the solution to these ethical challenges is going to be actually much more difficult than the development of the vaccine itself. That's pure science. It will take a time. It will shorten it. It will lengthen it. But I think that's child's play compared to what we're going to get if this epidemic continues or any other epidemic where we're never going to be suddenly at the level that we need to be with availability and who gets what. So on that note, Peter, I think we're ready to adjourn, and appreciate everyone coming, and I really thank the panelists. Just tremendously interesting discussions. Thank you, and good night.
Thank you.